Thank you very much and good morning. Shannon, when you list off all those places that I've been, it sounds like I've jumped around a lot, but it's a long, long span, so they weren't short stays. Right, I'm older than I look, thank you. I'm also excited to be, we have several city people that will be part of the event today. Excited to be one of those. Just to let everyone know, it builds from here. I'm the low bar, and then it will go up as we go along as other members of council and staff are involved. But as Shannon said, I'm Scott Hock. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation here for the City of Cedar Rapids. Happy to be here today to introduce Dr. George Hess. But before I ask him to come up to the podium, I'd just like to say a couple things in regards to just the importance of this. For me, when I came here last year, as someone who is involved in Parks and Recreation and knows the importance of the environment and spreading really what we would call the word, right, of that to the community, it was great to be here and meet some other key people within the community that also help kind of preach that word a little bit. So very happy to be here again this year and being part of the program. I got to meet Dr. Hess yesterday. I got to enjoy lunch with him right across the street from the amphitheater just right in downtown Cedar Rapids. And really the amphitheater is one of those things that really shows how we work to take a downtown area, make it vibrant by adding a great community amenity in the amphitheater that draws people in, but always keeping in mind the natural aspect of it, right? Planting native trees in the area, a large pollinator area within that footprint as well too, as well as integrated flood control protection for our community all along one of the best rivers in the Midwest. So it was great to meet him there. We talked about a lot of things. One of the things we talked a little bit about was the great new partnership that we have with Trees Forever and the Growing Futures program. I think through some of the slides today, you're seeing some of the pictures of some of the kids that are out planting trees now on the city right-of-ways. This is something that we went into a partnership this last year with the support of our council and mayor to really utilize at-risk youth that Trees Forever brings in. They teach them how to plant the trees, how to take care of the trees. They teach them other life skills as well. Really gives them the opportunity to have maybe that first job, all the while giving something back to the community and helping plant those trees along the right-of-way. Something that we were already doing within the city. Now we get to engage the youth in that program. So it's a great partnership, one of the many partnerships that we have with Trees Forever. So we're happy to be a part of it again and making sure that continues to grow and the partnership between us and Trees Forever continues to stay strong. So we also talked a lot about what Dr. Hess is doing. There's his work at North Carolina State with the Department of Forestry and Environmental Services. He works to conserve natural areas in the metropolitan regions and keep people connected to nature. And that's really what we're trying to do. He's a founding member of the Wake Nature Preserve Partnership and has served on the Wake County Open Space and Parks and Recreation Committee, as well as this town's Planning and Land Use Board, and is the chairman of the Tree Conservation Subcommittee. Now, Dr. Hess is originally from New York, but he's been in the South long enough that for us to say, oh yeah, it's a great balmy day here in Iowa, it's going to be almost 40 degrees. He's not buying that. He's not quite there anymore. However, he is an avid biker, cyclist, so if enough of us invite him, I'm hoping that we can get him back for RAGBRAI one summer. He hasn't been a part of that ride yet, so and if you haven't, well, you're missing something really great. And maybe the other ride too, the Bike Iowa ride. I'm not sure what side of the fence you are on that, but either one is fine. So if you could please help me welcome to the podium Dr. George Hess.
Let's see. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction. I'm supposed to put a bunch of stuff in my pockets here so you can hear me and things like that, so give me a second. I've got my phone up there. I'm going to tap it every once in a while just so I can keep track of time. I'm not checking my texts or my social media or anything like that. All right, let's see if I can get this mic on. I'll talk to this while I do it. So it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to spending the day with you all today. You can see I'm not wearing my coat, so maybe I am acclimating a little bit to the temperatures. So shortly after Joanne McNeil called me and offered me the opportunity to be here, this popped up on my news feeds. Let's see, is this thing working now? Ah, brilliant, perfect. And I thought, wow, how perfect is that? I am going to Iowa near Christmas to talk about trees. I mean, it was like they fed me this thing. And this is serious stuff, right? Tree-filled city parks make people as happy as Christmas Day, says a study of Twitter posts. So I'm going to walk away from that other mic. So what is this about? Ooh, feedback. Can somebody control this? Yeah, I think I got it. Okay. So this received quite a bit of press when it first came out. That was from something called Good News Network. This is from another blog called Interesting Engineering, which you'll see why it wound up there in a minute. And their tagline down at the bottom here, Santa Claus has some competition when it comes to eliciting smiles on Christmas Day. And the University of Vermont, where this study was conducted, put this up on their news feed. If you're feeling unhappy and cranky, maybe you should go to a park filled with trees. So should I just turn this off for a second and stand there? So anyway, yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
Rather than me troubleshoot and take up too much of your
No,
time.
no problem.
Sorry about that.
So yes. So what is this about? Well, it turns out that Twitter takes about 5% of their tweets at random and throws them into, let's call it a bucket. And researchers can pull those tweets out of that bucket and have a look at what's going on. So some folks at the University of Vermont, about a decade ago, started creating this device they call a hedonometer. And what it does is it analyzes the words in the Twitter feeds and puts them on a scale of happiness from 1, which is really sad, to 9, which is like unbelievably elated. And they do this worldwide. And it turns out that during Christmas time, the happiness index for the world jumps by about 2.4 points. That's pretty significant. That's like 25% almost. So what Aaron Schwartz and some of his colleagues at Vermont did was they pulled tweets just from San Francisco. They tagged them as to whether they came from within a city park or outside the city parks. And they found that the people's tweets from city parks were about 2.4 points higher in happiness than from the tweets outside the park, hence the news feeds for this. Pretty cool. They also found that that phenomenon lasted for a couple of hours. So people that were in parks got happy, they stayed happy for a while. They also became less self-absorbed, so using less I words and more sort of community we words. The other thing they did is they looked with satellites at the parks in the city and they rated them on a greenness index. Okay? And it turned out that bigger, greener parks got people happier than smaller, less green parks, like maybe city plazas that just had a little bit of grass or something in them. So pretty cool stuff. And what they took away from this, their sort of bottom actionable line here, was that maybe that urban planners and public health officials should think a little bit about how this could help them target nature contact for people who live in these urban areas. The other thing that they said that I found particularly interesting, because most of my work is about biodiversity conservation as opposed to public health, they noted that people who think about biodiversity conservation and people who think about mental health issues are usually talking in different rooms, different audiences, and they suggested that it might be cool for them to get together and see if there were things that could be done that would help address both of the issues of conservation and of mental health. So there's something to really think about. Okay. So what I want to do for the rest of my time up here is talk a little bit about this concept of bringing open space into our urban lives. And the way I'd like to do this is to throw out 3 examples of things that I've been involved with or studied, and hopefully draw some approaches and some ideas and some ways to think about things that might help us all do a better job. And then, of course, after I talk here, we can talk more later and we can share information in more depth. Let's see. Oh, yes. So before I do that, I want to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Jan Thompson. She's at Iowa State down the road in Ames. This is a picture of Jan at the Treaty Oak in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a really huge 250 some odd year old live oak tree. It's absolutely spectacular to see. We were there on a reconnaissance trip for one of our courses where we studied what was going on with open space in Jacksonville. Okay, so thank you, Jan. I'm sorry she couldn't be here. I'm going to go visit her tomorrow. All right, so my first story is going to be about an organization called Triangle Land Conservancy in North Carolina, which I've worked with for quite a few years on and off. It was formed in the 1980s, early 1980s, so kind of in the same decade as Trees Forever. It's what I would, at the time at least, lovingly call a tree hugger organization. So they were focused very much on conserving the valuable biological, the plants, the animals, the geological features that were identified in the North Carolina Natural Heritage Inventories for that area. I believe you guys have something called a Natural Areas Inventory. It's pretty much the same thing. Okay, and the person on the right there is Kate Dixon, who for a long time was the executive director of the organization. And they did some really great work. Just for reference and for comparison to where you are, the Triangle is a region in central North Carolina. It's about 3,300 square miles. Currently, it's home to about 1.9 million people. Back when they started, it was a lot less. It's called the Triangle because of the cities of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, which each house a major university. I won't bother to name them right now. And in the middle of that triangle was a place called Research Triangle Park, which is a very large business park. They started thinking about it in the 1950s, and it really took off in the 1960s when IBM became one of the first tenants. And it's become a huge economic engine for the region. So that's where it gets its name from. So most of the 1.9 million live in Wake County. Wake County has about 1.1 million. Durham is second largest, and a little bit in that lower southeast corner of Orange County. And then the edges, Chatham, Johnston, Lee, except where they border with Wake, are still very, very agricultural regions. So it's got an interesting mix of people and land uses there. So the first thing I want to talk about is this notion of telling a story, building a base of evidence to support the story that you're trying to tell so that it doesn't seem like you're just making stuff up, and then staking your ground, by which I mean saying what it is that you want to do and you want to accomplish in a very clear and forceful way. Oh, pay attention to this picture as we go through these. This is the Neuse River. What you're looking at is called the Milburnie Dam. It's the last dam on the Neuse River between Falls Lake, which was the major drinking water reservoir for Raleigh, which is not going to go away, and the Atlantic Ocean. And it was keeping some important fish from reaching that last 15 to 20 miles of river. Okay. So, as I had said, Triangle Land Conservancy was doing some really nice work. And as it got to be into the late 1990s, they started to worry. They were seeing growth happen at an increasing rate. They were seeing farms and forests disappear. And they weren't feeling like they were having enough of an impact and that there were not enough people paying attention to the changes that were happening on the landscape. And they tried to figure out what to do about that. And what they decided to do was to tell a story of those changes in the land, and to create something called the State of Open Space Report, documenting for the region what was going on. So at the time, I was on their board of directors. I was also the chairman of their planning and advocacy committee, and I was a newly hired assistant professor at NC State University. And I saw all these different conversations as a really neat way to put together my interest in outdoor spaces, in research, and in actually getting things done. So I joined up with them in producing this report. And the approach we took was to tell that story aimed at the audience of elected officials, policymakers, administrators, and county administrators and managers and things like that, in the hopes that they would then draw in their constituents and make some changes that would allow conservation to increase. So the way we did this is we first showed what was happening with population growth. And the story we told was that between 1950 and 2000, the population of the Triangle region tripled to 1.2 million. At the same time, the amount of land being developed per person on average also tripled. This is sort of an indicator of what we've come to call sprawling development. We didn't know it at the time, but also what was happening then was that real estate prices had also about tripled. So there was like this triple play of things that were changing the land. And what was happening as a result of that is that the farms and forests in the region were being converted to built environment. And I'm not standing here to say that's a bad thing, because people move into areas, they need places to live. But the concern was that the natural beauty and the natural features that were drawing people in were disappearing, and people were starting to worry about that. Okay. We also documented to the best we could. It was amazingly hard to figure out how much protected open space there was in the region. People just weren't keeping track of it. It turned out it was about 7% of the region. And when I talk about protected space here, what I mean essentially is space that is being managed for some kind of conservation or open space purpose, and there would need to be a public process to remove that protection. Okay? So not things that people could just turn around and sell and be gone, but stuff that there's a public process that would be required. Most of the protected open space was in Wake and Chatham counties, and most of it was owned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is kind of interesting. The reason for that is because in the Triangle are two very large reservoirs with big dams holding water back, and that's the water that the major municipalities use for drinking water. And those things are owned and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, and all the land around them was. So that's why there's such a big land ownership in Army Corps of Engineers. Those lakes were built in the 70s, sort of that kind of time frame. Okay. So, so an interesting story of change in population. We also had detailed tables, which I'm not going to show here, of who owned that open space and where it was. So we provided what I thought was a lot of valuable information to people. And for the next 6 months or so, we took this show on the road. And we talked about this to as many city and county organizations, governments, NGOs that would listen to us. Okay. And the stake that we put in the ground was this. So don't worry about the small words. I put them in big words down on the bottom. The stake that we put in the ground was that, hey, we can still protect this green infrastructure. We've got time, but we have to take concerted action in order to make that happen. Okay. And the way that we think we should do this, at least the first two steps, is that we should create something called the green print, which would be a description of where those places were that we thought were the most valuable, both for natural and for cultural purposes, like working farms and forests. And the second thing is that we needed to hire more land conservationists in the region. Any of you who have been involved in land conservation know that it takes forever sometimes. You have to develop relationships with people. You have to negotiate, you have to come to an agreement on what the terms are, what the prices are. It takes years sometimes. It's not something you just walk in and hand somebody a check and they're, yeah, okay, great, right? And there just weren't enough people to have that long-term impact that we were looking for. So yeah, that's where we went with that. And a lot of good things happened. We did create a green print. Just to cover it a bit on the left. I would have to say that its impact was indirect rather than direct. So it's not like everybody jumped on that green print and said, oh yeah, let's do this exactly like you guys wrote it. What happened instead was that the different cities and counties in the region created their own open space plans based on the kinds of thinking that we put in the green print, which was really very cool. I put Wake counties up here as an example because what they did was quite interesting. There's 12 cities in Wake County. They actually passed a bond in, it was either 2001 or 2002, for open space to protect water quality. And they used part of that money to bring all 12 municipalities together to talk about open space and create this consolidated plan that not only addressed county needs, but also addressed the needs of the municipalities within the county. It was kind of a cool idea. Okay. And then I would also have to say that not a whole lot happened on the ground. We had these plans, we had these ideas, but things were still moving kind of slowly. And I think the reason for that, based on some research that I did with some students after the fact, where we looked at the relationship between the quality of open space plans and actual implementation on the ground. And we found that the most important drivers were not how great the plan was, but how much time had been spent engaging the citizens and the stakeholders in the area and the elected officials in the area to get support for those ideas and to actually get them moving. Okay. So, relationships matter and the support matters. So that brings me to the second idea, which is this notion of reaching beyond the choir and engaging people where they are as opposed to where you are. So finding out more about what people care about and explaining to them, working with them to help everybody understand the value of conservation of open space for those purposes. So that brings us forward to 2008, 2009. We're still talking about Triangle Land Conservancy. And in the 2009 annual report, Ron Strom, who was the, I forget the title, the chairman of the board, there you go, for Triangle Land Conservancy. He also happened to be a real estate developer. Announced this new approach that Triangle Land Conservancy was going to take, whoops, wrong way, sorry, to talking about open spaces. And it's almost subtle, but it's kind of what I was just talking about. So instead of talking about simply protecting land because we should do that, right? Sort of the again, lovingly, the tree hugger approach. Instead, engaging people and talking about what the benefits are to them for conservation. So recognizing the legitimacy of and answering the question, what's in it for me? Okay. And the organization focused particularly on these 4 public benefits. The wording has changed a little bit through time, but essentially keeping our water clean, providing for local farms and food, providing habitat for the native plants and animals, so remember back to that sort of original core mission, and providing ways for people to connect with nature better than they currently do. So they put this big announcement out, and look at the year on that, right? So then we immediately fell into the deep, dark depths of the latest Great Recession. Triangle Land Conservancy and many other organizations went into survival mode. They trimmed their staff. They went back to their old ways of doing things because they sort of knew that kind of worked and would help keep them alive, and they weren't quite so sure about this new approach. And it really set things back for a number of years. So fast forward another few years. So now we're in about 2017, 2018. Things have picked up, staff has been rehired, things are starting to move again. Of course, the price of land has gone up again too. Too bad we didn't have a whole pocket full of cash back in 2008, 2009. They put out a strategic action plan in late 2017, and they really went back and re-emphasized this notion of the public benefits, and they drove some really explicit stakes into the ground around those. Okay. So the first thing they said is, we are going to double the pace of conservation for the next few years. We're going to get 7,000 new acres protected by 2025 so that we can have 25,000 acres protected in that time, at that time. So really explicit and sort of a galvanizing goal, all the 25s involved in that. And we're really going to focus all of it on the 4 public benefits that they talked about. So the plan, and pay attention mostly to the words on the bottom of this, don't worry about the small words. The strategic plan focused on each one of those goals in time and sort of stated in really nice words their vision for those goals. So I'm going to try and move this so I can see that because I haven't memorized them. So in terms of protecting natural habitat, okay, important natural areas and their wildlife are protected, connected, and buffered. It's sort of a statement of the world that we want the triangle to be, okay? On safeguarding clean water, the priority lands in the Upper Neuse River and Cape Fear, those are the rivers that feed the lakes, the reservoir lakes, will be identified and permanently protected through increased funding and financing mechanisms. And they've found ways that places like the city of Raleigh can actually purchase land in other counties along the watersheds that feed the lakes so that they can protect them. And they justify that because that's so much less expensive than having to build additional water treatment plants. So there's some real economic value in this as well. Talking about these public benefits has allowed the organization to really focus their conversations, their requests for donors, and the way they think about and communicate the need for conservation. So one example is that there was a donor particularly interested in these public values who helped them create what they call a catalyst fund. Basically, it's a pot of money that can be drawn upon to make quick purchases, quicker than municipal governments can respond to opportunities, and then they get replenished in the future, okay, so that they can then be reused again. And just in October, they closed a deal helped in part by that Catalyst Fund, where they protected 1,100 plus acres down in Johnston County. That was the one down on the southeast. So this is a bottomland that has great natural heritage and water quality values. It's on the downside of all the municipalities. So everything that runs downriver, from the triangle goes through this area, and it serves as a great filter so that communities further downstream who are drawing water from that river benefit from that filtering and don't have to pay for the mess that's getting into the water in the triangle, which is a pretty awesome thing. Okay. Oh, doing okay. In terms of supporting local farms and food, they're also doing some interesting things. They've purchased or put easements on quite a bit of farmland in the region, which allows farmers to stay in the face of what would otherwise be rapidly increasing property values. The essential approach is to create an easement in which the development rights are purchased. So the land loses all that development value and farmers can stay for longer periods of time. They're also partnering with other organizations to help new farmers get started, to put demonstration projects in place for more sustainable approaches to farming. And there's a couple of other things written up there. So this is having a really good benefit. Farmers are now stepping up, and donors who are interested in farming are stepping up to help the organization do a bigger and better job of this kind of conservation. One of the partners is an organization called Transplanting Traditions, and they work with a Burmese refugee community that has moved into the triangle. They provide the land in which that community can farm and help feed themselves. And they also provide youth educational programs focused on entrepreneurship, leadership, and communication. So, pulling together all these different threads, I think, is really, really cool and really amazing. The last one I want to talk about is connecting people with nature, and this is probably one of the most transformative things that they've done. And they're starting right inside the organization. If you notice, one of their goals is to increase the ethnic diversity of the board and the members, from which they then expect that there'll be increased attention to those issues out in the field. So this is the one thing I wrote down because there's such a great list of things they're trying to do. So they're bringing, instead of like what they used to do was like, let's go on a hike out in this remote place, they're doing things more in the urban areas where the people are living. So they're doing things like urban foraging hikes that are focused on edible plants, nighttime stargazing. We have chimney swifts that do this fantastic thing where they go in circles and then they drop into chimneys. They get people together to watch that. And they use all of these as opportunities to talk about nature and the value of conservation. Urban bikes and hikes to learn about the natural features in the area. They're doing cooking classes at local farms to get this whole sort of local food idea involved. I think I have a picture of this one. They're even doing a Beers from Here event every once in a while. So how this works is they get some people together in the city and they do some kind of service project like removing some nasty invasive plants. And then they give them beer that's brewed locally and they explain where the ingredients come from, and a lot of them are local as well. So you can just imagine the different groups of people that are getting involved by taking all of these approaches to connecting people with nature. Excuse me. And this is not just them. And so this is from the National Land Trust Alliance page. You can notice over there on the left, it has similar kinds of words. This focus on public benefits is a nationwide thing right now that's helping conservation. I'm not claiming Triangle Land Conservancy invented it. I'm just pointing out that it's not just them. This is something that's really catching on nationwide, if not worldwide. Okay, so let's walk away from Triangle Land Conservancy for a minute. And I'm going to bring your attention to the third item on here, which is honoring local context. Okay, because every place is different. So I'm standing here telling you about what Triangle Land Conservancy has done. It's not going to work for you guys in exactly the same way. But if you think about the kinds of things they did and about what's going on in your area, I bet some of the ideas can be translated to something that will work here. So that's what I mean by honoring the local context. And then the other is developing collaborative processes. Really, really important to include as many people as you can. And to illustrate this, I want to talk about the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, which is in Pima County, Arizona. Completely different place. Pima County is, whoops, wrong button, down on the very south side up against the Mexican border. Tucson is the major city in it. It's a different universe. This county is 9,000 square miles. It's the size of Vermont and New Hampshire. It's absolutely huge. Tucson is over on the east side. 40% of it here in the middle is First Nation lands. It's the Tohono O'odham Reservation. So the planning, and I'm going to talk about, is mostly on the east side over here where Tucson is. There's about 1 million people living in the county. Most of them live in Tucson and the surrounding cities. It's, again, very different universe, and I got a picture to show you that. This is what it looks like, right? Really long views. There are trees there, but it's a desert. They get 12 inches of rain a year. That's Interstate 10 in the foreground. That's about 12 miles back to the Catalina Mountains in the background. Tucson's at 1,000 feet elevation. Those mountains peak out at 9,000 feet. That's the sort of central downtown government complex and all that down there and there. There's a convention center. There's the football stadium for the University of Arizona. You got long sight lines in this place. I really like it. It's very cool. Okay. This is what passes as a river in Tucson. That's their major river. It's called the Santa Cruz River. It's got vegetation growing in it. It runs from south to north. Those are the Rincon Mountains, 15 miles in the distance. It's got a beauty of its own. I kind of like it. But it's really different than here, and it's really different than North Carolina. They also had some major flooding issues. So remember I said they had 12 inches of rain a year? In, I think it was 1983, they had 12 inches of rain in a day from a tropical storm that came in off the Pacific. It wreaked havoc on this river. It flooded. 75% of their highway bridges were destroyed. Houses were washed into the river. It was a disaster. I know you have your version in 2008. That was their wake-up call in terms of river. And if you look at this picture, you can see a little bit about what their response to that. This here on the sides is actually something called earth cement. It's not a natural thing. It's a hardened structure. They also purchased a lot of land along the rivers so that when it did flood, it didn't destroy property and the water could infiltrate. So they created some very intentional places where water could overflow the banks and infiltrate back into the ground rather than destroying the surrounding property. I could talk about that for a half an hour, but I don't have it, so we're going to move on to the next thing, which is in 1996, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared this bird as an endangered species. I don't think you've dealt with the Endangered Species Act here, but it brought everything in terms of development to a halt in the Tucson area. There was a school involved. People were going nuts trying to figure out what to do about this. And it's the Endangered Species Act, and it's the federal government, and you have to do something. You can't just walk away from it. So what Pima County decided to do, well, let me back up 1 second. There's actually two things you can do. You can set it up so that individual landowners, as they develop, have to deal with this sort of one-on-one with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The other thing you can do is create something called a habitat conservation plan, which basically allows you to take the endangered species or its habitat incidentally in certain places while you're developing it, as long as you're making up for it somewhere else. Okay. Pima County pretty much immediately decided they were going to go that route. Okay, so instead of every developer, every person having to deal individually with Fish and Wildlife, they buy these mitigation credits or get these mitigation credits from the county. But what they also did was they looked and they said, you know, we have a lot of other species of conservation concern, and we have a lot of other issues with quality of life and what's going on here that we need to address. Why don't we do something really, really big? And that's where the notion for the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan came in. And here's their stake in the ground. And just absorb that for a second and think about what that means. We're going to ensure the long-term survival of the full spectrum of indigenous plants and animals. That's one big vision. Okay. And of course, they realized they have to also balance that with economic development and population growth in the region. You can't just shut everything down. So what did they do? They embarked on this Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, and they did two major things. They created a science advisory committee composed of experts in various aspects of conservation. And their job was to create the technical plans for identifying the species, identifying their habitat, and identifying the conservation areas for those. So it's like, well, here's the map, and if we had the ideal world, this is what we do. And then you put that against the economic development and the other things that you have to consider in terms of a city in an area the size of Tucson and Pima County, and you deal with that. The other thing they did was create a citizen steering committee, and this is where it got really interesting. So instead of handpicking who was going to be on that committee, they just said, hey, who wants to come? Right. And they expected, 20, 30, 40 people to come. You know how some of that government stuff goes. You've been to meetings. Sometimes it's crickets. Sometimes it's crazy. This went crazy. They had almost 100 people show up at their first meeting, and they were standing there wondering, well, we need a bigger room, and trying to figure out how they were going to deal with it. They let everybody stay. And they developed something that became called a boot camp, where they brought in people to represent all the different perspectives that you need to think about as you design, develop, and manage a city and conservation in the city. So they brought in real estate developers, they brought in builders, they brought in conservationists, they brought in endangered species experts, ecologists, economists, people interested in cultural preservation, house preservation. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And every one of those groups of people had a chance to present to this steering committee their perspective. This is what doing cultural preservation is about. This is what it's like to develop and build homes on a site. These are the things that we have to do to keep our economy going. So they all learned about all these different aspects, which is really an amazing thing if you think about it. I don't think there's many people that know all those pieces. I mean, I'm not saying they became experts, but they at least understood where other people were coming from. And the conservationists realized that the developers weren't these evil people out to destroy the landscape. And the developers realized that the conservationists weren't all lunatics looking to stop their work. Right? Everybody had some skin in the game and was interested in what they were trying to do. Okay. And in the end, they developed 5 major elements, and they developed maps for each of those. And I'm just going to show those rather quickly here for time's sake. The core, of course, going back to that stake in the ground, was the biological corridor and critical habitat map. So showing where those important places were. And there were a set of guidelines along with each of them. So if you're going to develop in a core area, this is what we would like you to do. All of this got integrated into their comprehensive plan and their rezoning process. So there's different ways that this happened. The second element they had was for riparian resources, because water is gold in a place like this. And protecting those riparian resources is so very important. They had a special element just to deal with that. There's a lot of overlap here, which is also really useful when it comes to actually implementing the plan. Mountain parks and natural preserves spoke largely to people who are interested in recreation issues. Okay, so places where people could go and hike and bike and camp. Ranch conservation was absolutely critical. Remember I said that river ran from north to south, so protecting those ranch lands down in the south part helps protect the water quality going in. If you're talking about conservation in this part of Arizona and you're not talking to ranchers, you're not really talking about conservation, because they control and manage so much of the land. It's critical to work with them in order to make this happen. Oh, wrong way. I keep doing that. I'm sorry. And finally, cultural resources. Lots of Native American and early Spanish influenced cultural resources in this area, and it was absolutely critical to respect and recognize and support and protect those. The last thing I want to say about what they did is when it came time to get final passage of this plan, they really coordinated what happened during that meeting. So instead of 15 environmental organizations all coming up and saying basically the same thing, they brought in a different approach. So they got, that's just a list, sorry. They got, for example, the administrator of a brand new hospital that was built in the area to come in front of the county supervisor to say, we really need this plan. This plan is great for us because we're trying to attract top-notch doctors and top-notch staff. And they want this kind of stuff. This is what they're looking for. So we really support this plan. Okay. They brought in developers, builders, and they said, we really support this plan because quality of life issues are what our customers are looking for, and this plan provides those. It's in our best interest, and we support it. They had some First Nation people say, this plan respects our culture, it respects our elders, it respects our space, and we support this plan. This is a particular Hohokam tribe area, about 120 acres right in the Tucson area that's now protected. They protected, 230,000 acres already for this. So interesting end to this story is that the pygmy owl was delisted in 2006. The Fish and Wildlife Service decided it's not really a special separate species. It's the same as this other species, so never mind. But, as they had anticipated, there were other species that were becoming important for conservation concerns, so it was a good thing they did this anyway. The people I've talked to there in government and other organizations said this is in the DNA of our city now, of our county now. So the fact that it's not necessarily an endangered species anymore, it doesn't matter because this stuff is good anyway. It's really helped us. It's really helped us become a better city. Okay, so last thing, and I'm getting a little short on time, but this is going to work. I might go over 5. Last thing is I want to talk about bringing nature in. So if you notice what's happened in this background picture through time, that dam is gone. And that's what it looks like now. Okay. It was a really cool project. There's another thing that took like 10 years to happen. But that dam's gone. The fish have free reign of the rest of the river. It was really weird to walk across that bridge right after they did this. The weirdest thing was it was quiet. Dams make a lot of noise when water flows over the top of them. It just really freaked me out the first couple times I walked over the bridge that this picture was taken from. I didn't hear anything. Yeah, very cool though. All right, what's on our greenways? So this is going back to Raleigh, talking about our greenway system. Greenways are a great way to bring nature to people in cities and to help them get out of the cities to nature in a bigger scale. Okay. A lot of this work is done with students in my classes where we partner with Raleigh Parks, Wake County Parks to collect data and do research on what's going on their greenway trails. The so-called capillary greenway system in Raleigh is big and getting bigger. You can see it is running all over the city, and don't worry about what all these colors means, but this is sort of where we are and where we're going in terms of this greenway system. It just penetrates everywhere. It's fantastic. You get as close as you can to people and you bring them in. Wake County, so now we've gone out to the county, has taken this up too, and they help fund some of it. Their main things are we want to bridge the gaps that are not being covered between the cities. We want to bring communities together, and we want to connect parks with these greenways. I love these greenways. I mean, they're just so much fun. There are animals out there. So we put out these remote cameras that are triggered by heat and motion. These were put on the greenways. That's a nice little coyote there. Freaked people out when we started telling them there were coyotes on the greenways. They didn't realize it, but they're out there, and there's more and more of them all the time. So there's animals out there. There's also people out there, particularly on the weekends. So one thing I want to tell you is that this is in March. Okay, in March, you know, like cold, in North Carolina cold at least, right? In March, we have over almost 2,000 people out on Sundays on these trails. Just at the sites that we had cameras on, right? This is not everything, but that's a lot of people. And this was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It's even more now. It's grown tremendously. They're out there at different times of day than animals. The people are mostly out there during the day. Remember, again, this is March, so you can see spikes at sunrise, sunset. And the animals are out there at night mostly. But they interact. I see plenty of deer and other animals out there when I'm on the trail. Okay. So there's opportunities for contact with nature. Of course, the plants and trees are always there. There are people there, and they're doing all sorts of stuff. They're on foot, they're on bicycles. The people on foot are running and they're walking. The people on bicycles are mostly out there for fun, right? Some of them say, yeah, I'm not really commuting, but this isn't fun either because it really hurts. About 11% of them are out there actually trying to get to work or some other destination. Mostly adults. I did this in front of an audience the other day that had a guy called Robin Moore in it, and he does nature play areas and things like that. And he jumped up at this, because that's in low numbers, 7% youth. You know, everybody was like, wow, why aren't the kids there? And he basically said, well, most trails aren't designed for kids. If you think about it, it's a path. You get on it and you walk, or you ride a bike. How much fun is that if you're 5 years old? So one thing that he said was important to think about was putting places along the trails that children can stop and play at. Something that we hadn't really thought about before. Okay. So interesting things that we learned from data. Lots of people with dogs. We were delighted to find that most of them were on a leash. Okay. You notice some of these things don't add up to 100%. That's because sometimes because it was photographs at night, we couldn't tell. So we just left it out. And the main reasons that people are on the trail sort of get to this nature issue, right? They're out there for exercise, but they're also out there to enjoy the outdoors, to chill out. So now we're back to that mental health thing beginning, and to look at wildlife. So there's a really great connection here between these trails that we bring right into the cities and the nature part. So that connection to nature can really be made on these greenway trails. Okay, and they're beautiful. Wow, they're so gorgeous. One little bit of good news that I'll end with. So this is another study that came across the news feed in, it was late November, just before Thanksgiving. Talk about a headline to make you sit up and take notice, right? Urban dwellers who live near green spaces are less likely to die early. It's like, man, I'm going to move, right? So, this is not a surprise. What the thing that was really good here, fascinating here, was this is a really strong study. This is something that's called a longitudinal study, which means that people looked at data through time from periods of 4 to 22 years. So the problem with some other studies is you can't tell what had been going on before, like why are these people living longer? These folks were followed through time, looking at where they lived during that whole period. And what David Rojas-Rueda, who's at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, worked with colleagues at medical centers in Barcelona in Spain, they pulled this study together, and it was funded by the World Health Organization. The study covered, it says it right there, right? 8.4 million people in 7 countries through a lot of time. And they looked at where these people were living and the amount of green space within 1,600 feet, 500 meters of where they lived. And they actually used that same greenness index that I talked about earlier with the Christmas study. And they found that people who had more green space nearby lived longer. They didn't really nail down why, but they posited some reasons based on other studies, which I know that some of you are probably familiar with. Increased physical activity afforded by access to those kinds of green spaces. The reduced pollution, heat, traffic noise, all those things that we always talk about with respect to green spaces. And stress reduction, so maybe back to that mental health thing that I opened with. And their takeaway from all of this was that interventions to increase and manage green spaces are something that is an important consideration for public health. We really need to start thinking about this in big, big ways. Okay. So, yeah, I'm done. Woohoo! And I think I did it on time. Look at that. Yeah, 2 minutes. Yeah, I'll take that. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm going to be here all day. Be delighted to talk to you.
Do a few questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I've been told we have time for questions, which I will do my absolute best to answer. Eric, right? Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if I missed it, but the proximity to green space, it's not just a tree. Do you have any idea what the amount of space or what would qualify?
Okay, so Eric was asking about the details of the proximity to green space in that last study. So basically what they did is they used satellite data and they used that kind of greenness index. So places that are more green have a higher index. So they were using essentially a continuous variable in the study. And one of the variables was the width of the green space around that the residents of the people in the study, and another was how green it was. Right? Does that address your question? So, and they were looking within that 1,600 meter buffer. Okay. Am I not there yet?
I was just curious if there's a threshold on what doesn't count as green space.
I don't remember the details of what was the threshold on what counted as green space or not. Yeah,
Yeah, they did not count grass. In other words, low bluegrass.
Yeah, so the comment was, bluegrass might not count, and I'm not sure that that's true because I'm not sure the satellite can tell the exact difference between those things. So green is green. Yeah. Yeah. We'd have to dig into the study to find the answer to that. Yes, sir.
Were there studies or some results of the play areas next to bike trails you mentioned for children? Are there sources you could find or get information on that?
Yes. So there are several books, and I unfortunately don't remember all the titles. If you Google natural play areas, you will find numerous books. Robin Moore, Moore, has written at least one of those. So he and his partner design natural play areas not necessarily along greenways, but you could certainly take them and put them along greenways. And the main concept there is to have less structured play, so to provide places where there are natural features like holes in the ground, hills that you can roll up and down, trees that you can play around, things like that. Yeah. So yes, you can definitely find information about that, and I'm happy to help you do that if you run into trouble. Yeah. Sir?
Talk about building, community support, getting buy-in. What type of opposition did you run into? Like, who was opposed to what you were trying to do? Was there multiple opponents or anything like that?
Okay. So the question was, who was opposed to these things? At the outset, everybody can sort of butt heads about it. Developers worry about costs being driven up. Environmentalists worry about losing important spaces. And if you don't have conversation, you get sort of stuck in those modes. I know in Pima County, one of the things that came up repeatedly was this notion of you taking all this stuff off the tax rolls, so we're going to have to pay more taxes as a result of that. And every time what they did is they actually dug in and did some studies, and in that example they found out that, number one, most of the things that were taken off tax rolls were of such low value anyway, they were providing minuscule amounts of revenue. Number two, that the effect of those open spaces on the value of adjacent properties drove up their value and more than made up for any tax revenue that was lost to the open space being taken off the tax roll. So all of that opposition can be dissolved through time and conversation. Did I address your question enough? Yeah. I yield the floor.
Great job.
Thank you. Oh, I have to give this.